Chicago, 1929. A city built on steel, money, and blood. The era of Prohibition, when every sip of whiskey was a challenge to the system, and the streets belonged not to the police, but to the mob. In this city, two kings could not share one throne, and one of them decided to throw the other a bloody celebration. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 corpses, a wall riddled with bullets, and not a single witness. But what if I told you that the biggest secret of this slaughter isn't who ordered the hit, but who pulled the trigger? The authorities kept silent about it for decades, but the street legends don't lie. Watch until the end, and you will learn the shocking detail that changes everything. In the 1920s, the streets of Chicago were a boiling cauldron. Prohibition, instead of making the nation sober, created an entire industry of illegal alcohol. Bootlegging, speakeasies, gambling, all of it brought in colossal amounts of money. And wherever that kind of money flows, blood is always shed. Power on these streets belonged to the gangs, who divided the city into spheres of influence like hungry wolves tearing apart their prey. In the south of the city, he reigned, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, or simply Al Capone, the son of Italian immigrants who started as a bouncer in Brooklyn and became the unofficial mayor of Chicago. His organization, known as the Chicago Outfit, was a true corporation of crime. Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was a new-era businessman. He bribed politicians, judges, and police officers. His men controlled unions and laundromats. He was everywhere. Capone loved luxury, media attention, and power. He wore expensive suits, smoked cigars, and gave interviews presenting himself as a Robin Hood who simply gave the people what they wanted: booze and entertainment. But behind this mask was a ruthless strategist ready to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. His word was law, and his army of thugs was ready to carry out any order. But in the north of the city, Capone had a worthy rival, George "Bugs" Moran, an Irishman to the bone, stubborn and brutal. He was a gangster of the old school. Moran despised Capone and his Italians, considering them upstarts. His North Side gang was no less influential and controlled the northern districts of Chicago. They were known for their audacity and cruelty. The conflict between Capone and Moran was not just a business war. It was personal hatred. They made dozens of attempts on each other's lives. Capone's motorcade was shot up right in the city center. Bombs exploded in his favorite restaurant. In response, Capone's men killed Moran's key figures one by one. The city streets turned into a battlefield where any day could be your last. By 1929, the tension had reached its peak. Capone was tired of the defiant Irishman. Moran constantly hijacked his trucks of bootleg whiskey, which hurt not only his wallet, but also his reputation. Alphonse decided he'd had enough. He didn't just want to kill Moran, he wanted to annihilate him, to wipe his entire top command off the face of the earth as a lesson to others. He needed a plan, a perfect, daring, and bloody one. The architect of this plan, according to legend, was one of Capone's most loyal and ruthless lieutenants, Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn. After receiving the order from his boss, McGurn began to prepare the trap. He knew Moran was greedy, and the best bait for him could only be very cheap, high-quality whiskey. Moran took the bait. The deal was set for the morning of February 14th in a garage on North Clark Street, which served as the gang's warehouse and headquarters. The date was not chosen by chance, the irony of fate, to stage a bloody massacre on Valentine's Day. It was Capone's style, cruel and theatrical. Everything was ready. The mousetrap was set. All that was left was to wait for the main guest. The morning of February 14, 1929 was cold. 7 men associated with Moran's gang gathered in that garage, waiting for the whiskey truck. Among them were key figures of the gang, including Moran's right-hand man and even a random optometrist who just liked hanging out with gangsters. Bugs Moran himself was not yet among them. As often happens, he was running a little late. At 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac, looking very much like a police car, pulled up to the garage. 5 men got out. 2 were dressed in police uniforms, and 3 were in expensive civilian overcoats. The men in the garage didn't worry. Police raids were a common occurrence. Usually, it all ended with a small bribe, and everyone went their separate ways. They calmly raised their hands. "Hands up, face the wall," the command rang out. Moran's men obeyed. They stood with their backs to the newcomers, confident that this was just a routine shakedown. They didn't see the 2 men in civilian clothes pull Thompson submachine guns from under their coats. They saw nothing. They only heard a deafening roar that became the last sound of their lives. A lead storm rained down on them. 2 machine guns and a shotgun fired over 150 rounds in a few seconds. The wall behind the men was splattered with blood and pieces of flesh. 7 bodies collapsed onto the dirty garage floor. There was no chance of survival for anyone. This wasn't a shootout. It was an execution, cold-blooded, swift, and incredibly brutal. The killers acted like professionals. After everything went quiet, the 2 men in civilian clothes walked out with their hands up, while the 2 in police uniforms led them at gunpoint. To any casual bystander, it looked like a standard arrest. The police had apprehended the gangsters. The car drove away and silence returned to the street. The plan had worked perfectly. And where was the main guest of honor, Bugs Moran? Fate was on his side that day. Running late for the meeting, he was approaching the garage and saw the parked police car. Thinking it was a raid, he decided not to risk it and turned around to wait in a nearby cafe. This coincidence, this delay of a few minutes, saved his life. When the real police arrived, they were met with a scene that made even seasoned cops' hair stand on end. The garage looked like a slaughterhouse. 7 mutilated bodies lay in pools of blood. One of them was Frank Gussenberg. Despite 14 bullet wounds, he was still alive. "Who shot you?" a sergeant asked him. Gussenberg, loyal to the law of Omerta, the code of silence, gasped, Nobody shot me," and died 3 hours later. The news of the massacre blew up Chicago, and then all of America. People were used to gangland shootouts, but such brutality shocked everyone. This was no longer just about killing competitors. This was a slaughter carried out in broad daylight. The public was furious. Newspapers screamed with headlines, "The St. Valentine's Day Massacre." Everyone knew who was behind it. All fingers pointed directly at Al Capone. But the great Al had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murders, he was thousands of miles away from Chicago, at his estate in Miami, demonstratively giving a statement to the local prosecutor. It was impossible to hold him responsible for this crime. He was clean in the eyes of the law. Bugs Moran was broken. He survived, but he lost his entire crew, all his best fighters. When journalists asked him what he thought of Capone, he replied, "Only Capone kills like that." His empire collapsed overnight. He lost his influence, money, and power. He lived out his days as a petty robber and died in prison from lung cancer, forgotten by everyone. But this massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Capone himself. If the public had once seen him as a romantic gangster, he now became public enemy number 1. President Herbert Hoover personally gave the order, "Get Capone." The federal government threw all its resources at him. They couldn't prove his involvement in the murders, so they went after what he valued most, his money. Treasury agents, led by Eliot Ness, the famous Untouchables, began to dig into his financial empire. They looked for evidence of tax evasion, and they found it. In 1931, Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in America, was convicted not for hundreds of murders, but for tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The great Al Capone was released from prison a broken and sick man. His criminal empire was destroyed, and his former power was gone. He lived out his days as a petty robber and died in prison from lung cancer, forgotten by everyone. But this massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Capone himself. If the public had once seen him as a romantic gangster, he now became public enemy number one. President Herbert Hoover personally gave the order, "Get Capone." The federal government threw all its resources at him. They couldn't prove his involvement in the murders, so they went after what he valued most, his money. Treasury agents, led by Eliot Ness, the famous Untouchables, began to dig into his financial empire. They looked for evidence of tax evasion, and they found it. In 1931, Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in America, was convicted not for hundreds of murders, but for tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The great Al Capone was released from prison a broken and sick man. His criminal empire was destroyed, and his former power was gone. He lived out his days as a petty robber and died in prison from lung cancer, forgotten by everyone. But this massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Capone himself. If the public had once seen him as a romantic gangster, he now became public enemy number one. President Herbert Hoover personally gave the order, "Get Capone." The federal government threw all its resources at him. They couldn't prove his involvement in the murders, so they went after what he valued most, his money. Treasury agents, led by Eliot Ness, the famous Untouchables, began to dig into his financial empire. They looked for evidence of tax evasion, and they found it. In 1931, Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in America, was convicted not for hundreds of murders, but for tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. There it is, the devil in the details that changes everything. Capone didn't just eliminate his rivals. He organized a special operation involving out-of-town mercenaries disguised as police. This was a level of planning worthy of intelligence agencies. It shows just how vast and organized his empire was, capable of delivering such precise and untraceable strikes. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is not just a story about gangsters. It's a lesson about power, ambition, and how one event can change everything. Capone wanted to be the sole king, and for a moment he was. But the price of that crown was too high. He won the battle, but lost the war. His brutality turned the whole world against him and ultimately led to his downfall. The streets don't forget mistakes. They remember everything, both the triumph and the fall. This story is a reminder that any empire built on fear and blood will sooner or later collapse under its own weight. The laws of the streets are harsh but fair, and even the most powerful king can one day find himself on his knees. This legend lives on to this day, inspiring filmmakers, writers, and anyone interested in the dark side of human nature. It shows what people are willing to do for power and money, and how high one can fly before burning to ashes. This is not just a crime report. This is an epic about the rise and fall of titans. So that's it, the shocking truth about the bloodiest massacre in mob history. A story that proves there is no room for the weak at the top of the criminal world. But even the strongest fall with a deafening crash. Did you like the story? Do you want more tales that make your blood run cold? Then show your energy. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next episode. Tell me in the comments what you think of Capone's actions. As soon as we hit 1,000 likes, I'll release a video about Cosa Nostra and tell you about the Sicilian Mafia, whose laws and traditions laid the foundation for all criminal families in the world. Believe me, Their story will make you see the word mafia in a whole new light.